The bone snapped with a sound that was louder than the thunder rattling the window pane. Wet. Sickly. Definitive. It was the sound of something breaking that couldn't be put back together the same way. Imani knew this bone, her left radius, would heal. The doctors would say it was a clean break, that with a cast and time she'd be fine. But she'd never be fine again. Fine was a country she'd left behind the first time Marcus's hand became a fist. She couldn't scream. Not because courage lived in her. Courage was a luxury item, and she couldn't afford it. She couldn't scream because her daughter's survival depended on her silence. Zuri was pressed against her in the darkness of the utility closet, a 6-year-old frame burning with terror. Small fingers clamped over her own mouth like she was holding back a cry that might shatter the world. The air in the closet smelled of old mop water and something else. Something metallic that Imani recognized as fear. Her own fear, perhaps. Or her daughter's. Or maybe fear had its own scent. And it was filling this space like water filling a drowning child's lungs. Outside the closet door, Marcus's voice slurred through the thin apartment walls. The walls were so thin. Everything about this apartment was thin, fragile, ready to collapse. She'd chosen it because it was the cheapest thing in a neighborhood where nothing was actually cheap, where rent consumed everything and left nothing but marrow behind. Imani, I know you're in here. You think you can hide from me? In my own house. The lamp shattered. Not a soft tinkle of breaking glass. A violent, destructive crash that sent tremors through the floorboards. She felt it in her bones. How many lamps had he destroyed? How many pieces of their life had he smashed because the dinner was cold or she'd looked at him the wrong way or simply because the rage inside him needed an outlet, and she was the only one close enough to bleed. The footsteps were getting closer. Heavier. Hungrier. Her left arm hung useless at her side. The fracture screaming with a pain that seemed to mock her heartbeat. She had broken ribs from last month. The doctor had counted them carefully, his eyes full of practiced sympathy that made her want to die. She had bruises that had taken 3 weeks to fade to the color of old mustard, and she'd covered them with long sleeves because she was ashamed, because some part of her still believed this was her fault. This was what her life looked like now. A timeline measured in wounds. A history written in injuries. A future that stretched ahead of her like an endless hallway with no doors. She had one lifeline left. Her phone. Imani's trembling good hand fumbled for it. Her fingers slick with sweat and rainwater. The screen was cracked. A spiderweb of glass that cut into her thumb as she swiped it open. The light was blinding in the darkness of the closet, and for a moment, she couldn't see anything but stars. Her contacts appeared on the screen. Her mother's name was at the top of the list. She hadn't called her mother in 3 months. Her mother had told her to leave Marcus the first time she came home with a black eye, and Imani had chosen to stay. Pride had a cost, and she'd been paying it in blood ever since. She started typing with one thumb. Mom. He broke my arm. The words felt inadequate. How could she compress the entire architecture of her suffering into a text message? But there was no time to be eloquent. Marcus's footsteps were getting louder, closer, and his voice was taking on that particular tone. The one that meant he was working himself up into a state beyond rage, into something animal and unstoppable. Her thumb was slick against the cracked glass of the screen. The phone was old, falling apart like everything else in her life. She was aiming for the contact labeled Mom. But the phone moved, the cursor shifted, and her finger landed somewhere else entirely. She hit send. The text flew out into the universe, disappearing from her hands and into the digital void. Only after she'd sent it did she realize where it had gone, to a contact she hadn't thought about in 5 years. A number that lived in her phone like a ghost, a remnant of a different life, before Zuri, before Marcus, before everything fell apart. A man in a suit at the Obsidian Tower. She'd been a cleaning lady then, young and naive and desperate to save money for a better future. She'd been mopping conference room floors when she'd heard them talking, men in expensive suits, speaking in low voices about shipments and packages and numbers that seemed impossibly large. One of them had stopped her as she was leaving. You hear anything tonight, you forget it, he'd said. He was tall, with a face like carved stone and eyes that didn't blink. But if you ever see something you shouldn't, something you can't unsee, you text this number. He'd written down a sequence of digits on a business card. No name, just the number. Otherwise, he'd continued, his voice smooth as silk over a razor blade, You forget this number exists. You forget you ever saw me. You forget you ever worked at this tower. Understand? She'd nodded, too frightened to speak. She'd saved the number anyway. A ghost in her phone. A secret she'd carried for years without knowing why. A contact named Mr. K do not answer, which she'd laughed at nervously at the time. Who would want to answer a call from someone with that name? Now, in the darkness of the utility closet, with Marcus kicking down the door and her daughter trembling against her ribs, she realized her thumb had found that contact in her panic. The message had gone to a stranger. Mom, he broke my arm. Sent to a man who would probably delete it without reading it. Or worse, read it and decide it was worth investigating, only to find that she was nobody, nothing, just another damaged woman in a city full of damaged women. The closet door shook on its hinges. Once. Twice. Her phone slipped from her hands and fell to the floor of the closet. She didn't try to retrieve it. Instead, she curled her body around Zuri like a parenthesis, like a question mark, like someone asking the universe why? Why me? Why us? Don't look, baby, she whispered into her daughter's hair, which smelled like coconut shea butter and rain. Close your eyes. Just keep your eyes closed. The third kick splintered the wood. The cheap latch gave way with a sound like a prayer breaking. The door flew open, bathing them in the harsh light of the hallway, and Marcus stood silhouetted against it like a demon materializing from shadow. He was swaying. The alcohol had loosened his limbs but not his rage. If anything, it had sharpened it, focused it, turned it into something surgical and specific. He held a leather belt looped in his hand, the same belt he'd used to hold up his pants that morning, the same belt that had become an instrument of transformation in his hands. Found you, he whispered, and his voice was almost affectionate. That was the worst part. He spoke to her with the tenderness of a man touching something precious, something he loved so much he couldn't help but destroy it. You always make me do this, Imani. You know that, right? You always make me do this. He raised the belt. Imani squeezed her eyes shut. She'd stopped crying a long time ago. Tears were a luxury, a reason for him to hit harder. Instead, she pulled Zuri so close they became a single organism, a single heartbeat, a single prayer. She heard the whistle of the belt through the air. But it never landed. The penthouse sat above the clouds like a god's waiting room. The storm lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Kang-Dae didn't flinch. He had learned long ago, before the money, before the power, before the entire architecture of his criminal empire was constructed, that violence was natural. It was the way of things. Rain fell. Predators hunted. Empires rose and fell. This was the rhythm of existence, and only fools fought against it. He stood with a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The ice clinked softly as he swirled it. The sound was clean, civilized, almost meditative. This penthouse was built on a foundation of blood and violence and the broken lives of people who'd gotten in his way. But inside these walls, everything was hushed and beautiful and impossibly expensive. The city below was a grid of neon and shadow. He'd built his empire from that grid, brick by brick, threat by threat, deal by deal. The Seven Stars Syndicate didn't run on idealism or romance. It ran on clear-eyed pragmatism, and the understanding that the world sorted itself into two categories: predators and prey. Kang-Dae had chosen which one he'd be a long time ago. His phone vibrated on the black marble table. He didn't check it immediately. Kang-Dae didn't respond to notifications like a dog to a whistle. He moved on his own schedule, operated in his own time zone. The call had come in earlier. Something about a shipment delayed from Busan, something about dock workers demanding higher rates, and his lieutenants knew to wait for him to be ready. But this vibration was different. It came through his private encrypted line, the number that existed in no database he maintained, the one that was supposed to be impossible for civilians to reach. The number he'd given out only a handful of times in his entire life. When he finally picked up the phone, his dark eyes scanned the screen. He expected a status report. A coded message. A threat from a rival organization. Instead he read, "Mom. He broke my arm." Kang-Dae read the message once. Then he read it again. His dark eyes didn't move from the words, and everything inside him shifted. Not his face. His face remained a mask of absolute control. But something deeper, something he thought had died years ago. Something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed, suddenly cracked like ice under pressure. He didn't know the number. It came from no database, no network, no infrastructure he controlled. The number itself was almost theoretically impossible. How had this person reached his encrypted line? The encryption was state-of-the-art military grade. It shouldn't have been penetrable. But the message was flesh and blood and terror. It was a scream trapped in pixels. Kang-Dae set the glass of whiskey down slowly on the marble table. The ice clinked, that soft, civilized sound again. He'd had one rule for as long as he could remember. One rule that separated him from the feral animals that gnawed at the edges of the underworld. From the true monsters who wore human skin and preyed on anything that moved. One rule that made him something other than completely damned. You do not harm the innocent. The strong devour the strong. That was the law of nature, the law of the jungle, the law that governed everything from cells dividing to empires falling. But a child? A woman with a broken arm afraid to scream? That was cowardice. That was the act of something subhuman. His fingers moved across the phone's encrypted keyboard with the kind of speed that came from a lifetime of quick decisions made in high-stakes situations. He typed, "Stay there. I'm coming." He didn't ask who this person was. He didn't request identification or demand an explanation or call the police. He didn't question the miracle of reaching his private line or wonder about the odds of this text landing in his hands. Instead, he simply stood up, the whiskey forgotten on the table. He buttoned his black silk shirt over the tattoos that marked him as property of the Seven Stars. A sprawling geometric star that covered his entire back and shoulders, each point representing a different division of his criminal enterprise. Each point was paid for in blood and broken bones and burned bridges. The men who saw him move that way, with that particular fluidity, with that shift in his center of gravity that meant he'd moved into predator mode, they knew not to ask questions. They simply stepped aside and made room for the violence coming. Kang-Dae walked toward the private elevator. Imani heard the gunshot before anything else registered in her mind. Not loud. Not the way guns sounded in movies with their dramatic bang and their recoil that threw people backward. This was almost gentle. A sound like a book closing in a library. A whisper of physics and mechanics and a bullet moving faster than the speed of sound. Then Marcus screamed. His scream was high-pitched, almost feminine in its panic, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever heard come out of his mouth. Pain was the ultimate truth-teller. Everyone lied about everything else, but pain made you authentic. Imani opened her eyes to see Marcus on the floor, clutching his thigh, blood blooming like a dark flower on his cheap jeans. The blood was real. That was her first thought. So much blood. It was spreading in a circle, soaking through the fabric, dripping onto the cracked linoleum floor. Standing in the doorway, framed by lightning and rain, was something that didn't belong in this apartment, in this neighborhood, in this entire dimension of her world. He was tall, impossibly tall, filling the cramped hallway. He wore a suit that looked like it was woven from midnight, tailored to perfection, probably worth more than everything Imani owned in the world combined. His face was sharp and angular, carved from marble and violence, but the most striking thing about him were his eyes. His eyes were voids. Kang-Dae didn't look at Marcus writhing on the floor. He stepped over him like an insect, barely acknowledging the man's existence. He crouched down, his expensive Italian suit brushing the mop-water floor without a hint of concern about the stain it might leave. He was close enough that Imani could smell him. Rain, expensive cologne that probably cost more than her monthly food budget, and something else underneath it all. Gunpowder. The metallic tang of violence. "You sent the text?" His voice was a low rumble, a baritone that vibrated through the floor and up into her sternum. It sounded like stones grinding together deep underground. Imani could only nod. Her throat had closed. Speech was no longer a function her body could perform. Terror lived in that space now, a permanent resident, a squatter in her larynx. "Then you are my responsibility," he said. And the words were delivered as a statement of fact, like a natural law. Like gravity. Like the sun rising in the east. He extended his hand. It was large, the knuckles scarred and rough, the kind of hand that had done terrible things. A geometric star peeked out from the cuff of his shirt, the tattoo spreading up his wrist like a brand, like a mark of ownership. Imani hesitated. She looked at the hand. She looked at the man's face. Still a stranger, still dangerous, still fundamentally unknowable. Then she looked at Marcus, still writhing on the floor. And she realized something that would reshape the architecture of her entire existence. There were worse things than the unknown. She took his hand. His grip was firm but not cruel, strong but not violent. He helped her to her feet with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his appearance, everything about the violence that had just occurred. "Your daughter," he said, looking at Zuri. "Can she walk?" Imani nodded. She was holding her daughter's hand, and Zuri was looking up at this monster with the unguarded curiosity of a child who didn't yet understand that some things were dangerous. Or maybe she understood perfectly. Maybe children understood danger better than adults did. They just hadn't learned to rationalize it away yet. "Then we leave." "Now," Kang-Dae said. "Do you have anything you need?" Imani looked around the apartment, this place that was supposed to be home that had become a prison. All of her belongings meant nothing. Her clothes, her dishes, her small collection of books. All of it could be replaced. The only thing that mattered was wrapped around her hand. "No," she said. "Nothing." They moved quickly. Kang-Dae had come with security, 2 men who appeared out of the darkness like ghosts, moving with the silent precision of trained soldiers. They swept through the apartment with the efficiency of people who'd done this 100 times before, clearing rooms, checking corners, making sure there were no other threats. As they left, Imani heard Marcus still groaning on the floor. She didn't look back. She had spent enough of her life looking back, replaying moments, wondering what she could have done differently. The past was a graveyard, and she refused to be buried in it. The car was sleek black, with tinted windows that turned the outside world into a shadow play. Imani sat in the back with Zuri, who was pressed against her side, exhausted from terror and adrenaline, her eyes growing heavy with the promise of sleep. They drove through the rain-streaked streets and Kang-Dae sat across from them, his dark eyes never leaving Imani's face. It was the kind of stare that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead it felt like being truly seen for the first time in years. "What's your name?" he asked. "Imani," she said. "My daughter is Zuri." "I'm Kang-Dae," he said, and it was the first time she'd heard him speak a complete sentence that wasn't a command. "Welcome to your new life." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they felt like a promise. When the private elevator doors opened, Imani gasped. It wasn't just an apartment. It was a fortress. The floor was polished black marble, reflecting the city lights like a lake of dark water. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a view that made her dizzy. The entire city spread beneath them, a universe of lights and neon and possibility. It felt cold, sterile, impossibly powerful. "Sit," Kang-Dae commanded, pointing to a sprawling white leather sofa. Imani hesitated, looking down at her torn jeans and the blood smeared on her arm. I'll get it dirty." Kang-Dae turned, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought she'd offended him, that she'd somehow violated some code of his world that she didn't understand. Then his expression shifted just barely, and she saw something underneath. A flash of something almost human. "I said sit," he repeated, but his tone had softened. Not kind exactly, but something approaching it. She sat. Zuri immediately curled up against her uninjured side. Her breathing evening out as sleep claimed her. A private doctor arrived within minutes. A stern woman with graying hair and the kind of efficient competence that spoke of decades working in dangerous situations. She set Imani's bone with movements that were swift and brutal, her hands sure and practiced. The pain was immense, but Imani didn't cry out. She'd learned to carry pain silently. The doctor wrapped the arm in a waterproof cast, administered an injection of painkillers that made the edges of the room soften, and left without asking a single question. When she was gone, the silence in the penthouse was deafening. The storm outside seemed miles away, muffled by the thick glass. "Why?" Imani finally whispered. Her throat was raw from not speaking, and the question had been burning in her chest since the moment he'd shot Marcus. Kang-Dae was standing by the wet bar, pouring a glass of water. He paused, the pitcher hovering in midair. When he turned to look at her, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, exhaustion, but also something deeper. A kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. "Because nobody else was going to," he said simply. He walked over and handed her the glass of water, and his fingers brushed hers for just a moment. You texted my private line. That number doesn't exist on public servers. Nobody should have been able to reach me. And yet you did. He sat down, not on the sofa, but on the edge of the coffee table, close enough that she could smell the gun smoke still clinging to his clothes. Which means one of two things, he continued. Either you're an exceptionally skilled hacker who managed to infiltrate military-grade encryption, or fate decided it was time for you to exist in my world. And you believe in fate? Imani asked. I believe in what I can touch, Kang-Dae said. And I can touch this. I can touch you. Which means it's real, and which means I'm responsible for you now. He stood up, his coat flowing behind him like a cape, like armor. Sleep, he commanded. Rest. Heal. The doors lock from the inside. Nobody gets in unless I allow it. Not your ex-husband. Not the police. Not God himself. He walked toward his study, and Imani watched him go. This stranger who had materialized in her life by accident. This killer who had saved her. She didn't know what was happening. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time in 3 years she felt something that might have been hope. Imani woke to the smell of coffee and something else, something warm and comforting. Zuri was no longer sleeping against her side. For a moment panic seized her throat. Her daughter was everything, her entire reason for breathing, and the thought of her missing sent her into a state of primal terror. But then she heard a small voice, soft and curious, filtering in from the common area. Is this really purple? Or is it just the light? Zuri was asking someone. Imani's legs moved faster than her mind could process, and she stumbled out of the bedroom, a guest room that Kang-Dae had prepared, with its own bathroom and expensive linens that felt wrong against her skin, like sleeping in a museum. What she saw stopped her breath entirely. Kang-Dae was on the Persian rug on his knees, with a pink plastic hairbrush in his massive hands. Zuri's curly hair fell around her shoulders like a crown, and he was carefully, methodically working through the knots, starting at the ends and teasing upward with a patience that contradicted everything about him. He was a man who could disassemble a sniper rifle blindfolded, a man who commanded armies, a man whose hands had surely done terrible things, and he was braiding her daughter's hair with the gentleness of someone handling something infinitely precious. Imani felt something inside her that had been locked away for a very long time begin to crack open. Zuri looked up and saw her mother. He's really good at this, she said with the kind of innocent assessment that only a child could provide. Better than Marcus. Kang-Dae's hands paused for just a moment at the mention of her ex-husband's name. Then he continued braiding, his movements sure and precise. Your mom usually does this, Zuri was explaining to him. But she can't because of her arm. Your mom is healing, Kang-Dae said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate through the floor. And I'll do it until she can again. Imani watched them for a moment longer. And in that moment, something shifted in her understanding of who this man was. He wasn't just a killer. He wasn't just a criminal. He was something more complicated, something that contained multitudes, contradictions, depths. Later, after Zuri had eaten breakfast and was drawing in her notebook, Kang-Dae found Imani on the balcony, looking out at the city below. The painkillers were wearing off, and her arm was beginning to throb with a dull ache that felt almost clean honest pain, the kind that was earned. How's the pain? He asked. It's fine, she lied. He didn't call her on it. Instead, he leaned against the railing beside her, and for a moment they stood in silence, watching the city breathe beneath them. I need to ask you something, Kang-Dae said finally. And I need you to answer me honestly, even if the answer frightens you. Imani's stomach tightened. Okay. Why did you choose to stay with me? He asked. Why didn't you go with Detective Roar when he came to the apartment this morning? Imani blinked. Detective Roar? She didn't remember. The adrenaline and pain had created gaps in her memory, blank spaces where things had happened without her full awareness. There was a detective, she asked. Kang-Dae turned to look at her, and his expression was grave. Around noon, when you were resting, he had a badge. He told you I'd kidnapped you. He told you that if you left with him, you'd go to a shelter, enter a protection program, get your life back. The memory surfaced then, or rather the absence of memory. A gap. A missing piece. I don't. I don't remember that. I know, Kang-Dae said. The painkillers made you drowsy. But you heard him. And you refused to leave. You looked at his badge, his uniform, the symbol of law and order, and you chose a stranger who had just shot your ex-husband in cold blood. He stepped closer to her. I need to know why, he said. Because I need to understand if you chose me out of desperation, or if you chose me out of something else. Imani was quiet for a long moment. The city stretched out before them, and somewhere down there, in the grid of streets and buildings, was her old life. The apartment where Marcus had broken her bones. The hospital where they'd asked if she was safe at home. The shelter where they'd offered her a bed and a list of resources that never actually helped. The law failed me, she said finally. Every time I called 911, they took 45 minutes to arrive. Every time I filed a report, nothing happened. I filed a restraining order, and Marcus used it as a coaster for his beer. The law was supposed to protect me, and all it did was tell me to be patient, to trust the system, to believe that justice would eventually come. She looked at Kang-Dae. But you came in 5 minutes, she continued. You came when nobody else would. You arrived without being asked, without any obligation, and you shot the man who was destroying my life. The law never would have done that. The law would have taken statements and filed paperwork and told me to wait for due process. You're saying you trust me? Kang-Dae asked, and there was something vulnerable in his voice. I'm saying I trust the version of you that exists in this moment, Imani replied. I don't know who you are or what you do, or what you want from me. But I trust that right now in this penthouse you're choosing to protect me. And that's more than anyone else has ever done. Kang-Dae reached out and touched her face, his scarred hand gentle against her cheek. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he just looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to see all the way through to her bones. I was empty, he said quietly. For a very long time I was hollow inside. I built an empire that was supposed to fill that emptiness, but it never did. And then your text came through, and for the first time I felt something real. He dropped his hand. I can't promise you safety, he continued. In fact, I can promise you the opposite. Knowing me, loving me, being connected to me, it will make you a target. But I can promise you that I will move heaven and earth to keep you alive. I can promise you that I will die before I let anyone hurt you again. That evening, Kang-Dae brought Imani to his study, a room lined with books and dark wood, smelling of leather and old money. He pulled a photograph from a locked drawer. It showed a blue notebook, worn and battered, with a cartoon cat on the cover. Do you recognize this? He asked. Imani's blood ran cold. She did recognize it. And in that recognition everything shifted. The air seemed to thin, the world seemed to tilt. That's... She began. A ledger, Kang-Dae finished. The ledger. The one that's been missing for 4 years. The one that contains the names of every major player in the Vipers operation. The judges they've paid off, the cops on their payroll, the murders they've contracted. Everything. Imani's voice came out as a whisper. Why are you showing me this? Because I think you know where it is, Kang-Dae said. Imani sat down heavily. The memory came to her. A Tuesday afternoon 5 years ago, rain drumming on the windows of the Gilded Rose. She was packing her things in a cardboard box, her belly already swollen with Zuri. Marcus's promises of a better life echoing in her ears. She'd grabbed what she thought was scrap paper from the recycling bin. The blue notebook. She thought it was empty. She thought she'd reuse it for Zuri's drawings. She didn't think she was stealing evidence. She didn't think she was stealing anything. Oh God, she said. Oh God, it's in Zuri's notebook. It's been in her notebook the whole time. She draws on the empty pages, and underneath there are numbers, names, columns of information. Kang-Dae's expression went very still. Marcus wasn't a drunk who happened to become violent, he said quietly. He was placed with you. They were using him as a tool. They were watching you, waiting, counting on you being desperate enough to run. And when you ran, they were going to catch you, and they were going to find that notebook. They were hunting me. The realization felt like another bone breaking. They've been hunting you for 4 years, Kang-Dae confirmed. But they were patient. They were willing to take years to get that ledger back. And they were willing to break every bone in your body to do it. The night market existed in the space between law and chaos, between daylight and darkness. It was where the Afro-Korean fusion of the city was most alive. The smell of chapati frying and ghee mixing with the pungent aroma of kimchi stew. Afrobeats thumping from one speaker while K-pop blasted from another. The entire neighborhood a living, breathing contradiction that somehow worked. Kang-Dae brought Imani and Zuri there at night, when the streets were most crowded, when they could disappear into the press of bodies and colorful fabrics, and the beautiful chaos of people trying to survive in a city that didn't particularly care about them. They stopped at a nondescript door tucked between a laundromat and a fabric shop selling kaitinge cloth. There was no sign, just a faded red lotus painted on the steel frame. Kang-Dae knocked with a specific rhythm, 2 loud, 1 soft, 3 fast. The door opened to reveal an elderly woman wrapped in colorful shawls, her white hair rising around her head like a cloud, her skin the color of ancient mahogany. Kang-Dae, she said, and her voice carried the weight of history, of shared past, of secrets kept. You look like death warmed over. Good to see you too, Mama Soul, he said, and for the first time Imani heard genuine warmth in his voice. Not control. Not calculation. Just love. Simple, uncomplicated love. Mama Soul pulled them inside and locked the door with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd been doing this her entire life. Pulling broken people inside, offering them shelter, healing them with the precise knowledge of which herbs to use and when. The back room was an apothecary. Shelves lined with jars of dried plants, bottles of tinctures, the smell of medicinal herbs and bone broth. It was a sanctuary. It was a place outside of time, outside of law, outside of the reach of the city above. This is Imani, Kang-Dae said, introducing her with the kind of formality usually reserved for important dignitaries. And this is Zuri. They're going to stay with you for a while. How long is a while? Mama Soul asked, her sharp eyes moving between Kang-Dae and Imani, reading them like books. Until it's safe, Kang-Dae said. It'll never be safe, Mama Soul replied. Not in this city. Not in this world. But we do our best anyway, don't we? She turned to Imani and took her injured hand gently. You've been hurt, Mama Soul said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Imani replied. By a man. Yes. Mama Soul nodded slowly. There are too many men who hurt women in this city. Too many men who think that pain is love, and violence is passion. She looked up at Imani. Are you strong? Imani wanted to say yes, but she wasn't sure. She wanted to say no, but she knew that wasn't true either. She was something in between, broken but not destroyed, damaged but still breathing. I don't know, she said finally. You will, Mama Soul said. By the time this is over, you'll know exactly how strong you are. She turned to Kang-Dae. This one, she said, gesturing to Imani. She's important. I can see it. Be careful with her heart. I'm always careful, Kang-Dae said. No, you're not, Mama Soul replied. You're reckless. You've always been reckless. It's going to get you killed one day. But until then, maybe it saves someone instead. The next morning, Kang-Dae received a message through his encrypted channels. The Vipers were moving. They were done waiting. They were done letting Imani live in hiding. They wanted the ledger back and they were willing to bring war to get it. He brought her to the docks to show her something, to teach her something about the world she'd been pulled into. They're going to hunt you, he said as they stood on top of a shipping container, watching the cargo ships move in and out like whales. Not with mercy. Not with restraint. They will burn down everything you care about until you have no choice but to surrender. Then what do we do? Imani asked. We hit them first, Kang-Dae said. We show them that taking you means taking on the entire 7 stars. We show them that the cost of that ledger is higher than they're willing to pay. He was interrupted by a phone call. His face went dark as he listened. They have Mama Soul, he said when he hung up. Imani's heart stopped. No. Roar took her, Kang-Dae said. He's using her as leverage. They want us to bring them the ledger, or they kill her. Imani thought about Mama Soul's kindness, her knowledge, her willingness to shelter them without judgment. She thought about how she'd been given safety when the world had decided she didn't deserve it. We're not sacrificing her, Imani said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Kang-Dae looked at her, and something changed in his expression. Some recognition. Some acknowledgement that she was more than a victim. That she was capable of being something else. No, he agreed. We're not. The base of operations was deep underground, literally beneath the city, in a network of tunnels and abandoned subway stations that predated the modern infrastructure above. It was a place where the Seven Stars kept their weapons, their money, their secrets. It was also where Kang-Dae explained the full picture to Imani. The Vipers run the clean side of organized crime, he began, spreading documents across a metal table. They launder money through legitimate businesses. They bribe officials. They move product through official channels. They're sophisticated, organized, professional. He pointed to a photograph of Detective Roar. But Roar and his unit are something different, Kang-Dae continued. They're black ops. They're the solution for problems that can't be solved through official channels. When a journalist gets too close to the truth, Roar makes them disappear. When a witness refuses to cooperate, Roar eliminates them. They're assassins in police uniforms. How many people have they killed? Imani asked. Kang-Dae paused. We don't know the exact number. But the ledger that Zuri has been drawing in, that's going to tell us. Every disappearance. Every murder. Every name. He pulled out a tablet and showed her images of the notebook. Scanned pages where Zuri's crayon drawings overlaid dense columns of handwriting. Names. Dates. Numbers. All of it suddenly visible if you looked at the pages at the right angle. That ledger is worth killing for, Kang-Dae said. Because it doesn't just incriminate Roar. It implicates judges, politicians, city councilmen, the mayor's office. Half the city government is on that Viper payroll. Then we go to the authorities, Imani said. We give it to someone who can. There is no one, Kang-Dae interrupted. That's what the Vipers understand that you don't yet. There is no white knight coming to save you. There is no justice system waiting in the wings. There's just power, and whoever has more of it wins. He stood up and walked to the edge of the room, where weapons were mounted on the walls, guns, knives, things that looked like they belonged in a military arsenal. So we're going to take matters into our own hands, he said. We're going to war. But before they could go to war, they had to get Mama Soul back. Kang-Dae orchestrated it with the precision of a chess master moving pieces across a board. He had informants throughout the city, people in the police department, people in the government, people in the shadows who owed him favors or feared him enough to do what he asked. The Vipers had taken Mama Soul to a warehouse by the docks. They were keeping her there, waiting for Kang-Dae to bring the ledger. He had a different plan. Imani found herself in a situation she never would have imagined. Weapons training with Kang-Dae's head of security, a woman named Captain Lee who had the eyes of someone who'd killed people and didn't particularly regret it. The gun is a tool, Captain Lee explained, teaching Imani how to hold it, how to aim it, how to manage the recoil. It's neither good nor evil. It's just power concentrated into a single moment. The question is what you do with it. Imani's broken arm was healing, though the cast still restricted her movement. She trained with one hand, learning to be effective despite her limitations. Why are you teaching me this? Imani asked. Because Kang-Dae believes in you, Captain Lee said simply. And I trust his judgment. 3 days before the assault on the warehouse, Mama Soul managed to escape. She appeared at the door of Mama Soul's apothecary at dawn, bruised but unbroken, her eyes still sharp with intelligence and defiance. The old ghost got away, she announced, and then she promptly collapsed. She had a broken rib, severe bruising, and what looked like the early stages of an infection from one of the wounds. But she was alive and she was furious. While Kang-Dae's doctor treated her injuries, Mama Soul told them everything she'd learned while imprisoned. The ledger is worth more than money to them, she said, lying on the medical table with the kind of dignity usually reserved for queens. It's worth political power. The Vipers have been blackmailing the city government with it for years, extracting favors and protection. But they've realized something. They can't use the leverage they already have because revealing it would expose them. She paused, her breathing labored. So they're pivoting, she continued. They're building an exit strategy. They want to sell the information to the federal government, to the anti-corruption task force in exchange for immunity. They want to burn the city government, position themselves as heroes, and walk away clean. Which means they need that ledger intact, Imani said, understanding the implications. Which means they need me. They need you alive with the ledger. Mama Soul confirmed. But that's their only constraint. Once they have it, you become expendable. She looked at Kang-Dae. They're planning something for tomorrow night, Mama Soul said. A meeting at the harbor. Roar is bringing in federal agents from out of town. People the Vipers have already bought. People who will make the handoff official and legal. Once that happens, the ledger becomes government property, and you. She looked at Imani. You become the only loose end. The docks at night were a different world. Imani moved through them in darkness, wearing clothes designed for concealment, carrying weapons she'd only learned to use days ago. Kang-Dae was beside her, wounded from the earlier assault but still operational, still lethal. Above them, on a raised platform overlooking the main loading area, Roar stood with the ledger in his hands. He wasn't alone. There were Viper soldiers everywhere, positioned like a military unit. And there were federal agents too, men in suits with earpieces and weapons concealed under their jackets. Let Mama Soul go, Kang-Dae called out, his voice carrying across the cavernous dock. She's free to walk, Roar replied. The question is whether your new girlfriend is going to walk out of here alive. He gestured to Imani, forcing her out of the shadows where she'd been hiding. The ledger, and I let the kid live, Roar said. Your operation survives. Everyone walks away winners. If I give you that ledger, you have no reason to let any of us live, Imani said, her voice steady despite the fear that was trying to choke her. Roar smiled. True. But I need you to understand something first. You were never meant to matter, Imani. You were always just the key to getting the ledger. We were patient. We were willing to spend years getting you broken, getting you desperate, getting you to the point where you'd do anything just to survive. He held up the notebook, showing it to the federal agents. This makes everything legal, Roar continued. This makes us the heroes of the story. This gets us protection, federal immunity, safe passage out of the city. And what happens to the people in that ledger? Imani asked. The judges? The politicians? The innocents who got killed? That's not our problem, Roar said. That's the system cleaning itself up. Imani pulled out the flare gun she'd hidden in her jacket, a tool designed for maritime emergencies, but useful for other purposes too. She fired it straight up. The flare exploded over the docks in a burst of brilliant red light. It was the signal. Kang-Dae's army moved. They came from the containers, from the water, from the shadows. Dozens of Seven Stars members, armed and coordinated, moving with the precision of a military unit. They weren't just criminals. They were soldiers in a war that the city didn't know was happening. The Vipers reacted with violence, but they were disorganized, caught off guard. The federal agents tried to retreat, realizing they'd been set up, that they'd walked into something far deeper than they understood. Roar realized too late that he'd made a tactical error. He turned to run, and Imani did something she never thought she was capable of. She shot him. Not to kill, to wound. She aimed for his leg, and her shot was true, trained by days of practice and fueled by the memory of Mama Soul's bruised body, of her own broken arm, of every woman who'd ever been hunted by men like this. Roar fell, screaming, and the federal agents surrendered. The ledger fell from his hands and landed on the wet pavement. Imani picked it up. The city didn't explode into chaos. At least not outwardly. What happened was slower and more systemic. The federal task force took the ledger and the evidence, and they began their investigation. One by one, the names in that book began to fall. A judge resigned suddenly. A councilman's office was raided. The mayor found themselves under federal scrutiny. It took 6 months, but by the end, everyone on that ledger who'd been involved in the Vipers operation was either arrested or fled the city. Roar went to prison. The Vipers were dismantled from the inside, their power structure crumbling once their federal contacts were removed. But Imani wasn't in the city to see most of it happen. She was in a cottage by the sea. Kang-Dae had given her a choice. She could testify against the Vipers, enter a protection program, leave him forever. Or she could choose something else. She'd chosen to stay. The cottage was simple, away from the city, far from the grid of streets and towers that had nearly destroyed her. There was sand outside and waves, and the kind of endless horizon that made you feel like the past couldn't reach you. Zuri was drawing again. Not in the ledger anymore, but in new notebooks, in colors and shapes, and a vision of the world that was innocent and beautiful. She'd recovered from the trauma with the resilience of childhood, though the nightmares still came sometimes. Kang-Dae's wound from the dock hadn't healed cleanly. The bullet had done damage to the muscle, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Slowed him down. Made him mortal in a way he hadn't been before. That was fine. He spent his time differently now. He'd given up most of his operations, kept only what was necessary to maintain his power base. He spent afternoons sitting on the porch, watching Zuri play in the sand. He spent evenings with Imani talking about nothing important, learning how to be human in a way that had nothing to do with power or violence. Do you regret it? Imani asked him one night as they watched the sun set. Giving up your empire for this? Kang-Dae took her hand. His fingers were still scarred, still marked with the tattoos of his past. I don't have an empire anymore, he said. I have a life, and I have you, which is more than I ever had before. Imani leaned her head against his shoulder. She thought about the night of the wrong text, about how chance and timing and a man who believed in responsibility had saved her life. She thought about Mama Sol, who was recovering in a safe house, preparing for the day when she could emerge and return to her apothecary. She thought about all the women still in the city, still trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped. She knew that Kang-Dae's money was going to them now. Funding shelters, supporting organizations that helped women escape abusive situations. He was using his power differently, using it to rebuild instead of destroy. Tell me about the first time you knew, Kang-Dae said, interrupting her thoughts. The first moment you realized you felt something for me. Imani smiled. When you braided Zuri's hair, she said without hesitation. When I saw those massive hands, those scarred knuckles, working so gently to untangle the knots. That's when I realized you weren't just a killer. You were someone capable of tenderness. Kang-Dae pulled her closer. You changed me, he said. The moment you texted that wrong number, you changed the trajectory of my entire life. It wasn't wrong, Imani replied. Maybe it was exactly where it was supposed to go. They sat together as the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, painting the sky in colors that had no names, no rules, no constraints. Somewhere in the city, the machinery of government continued to turn. New officials rose to fill the positions left vacant by corruption. The police department restructured itself, removing the rot. The world kept spinning. But here on this beach outside of time, outside of the reach of the city, two people who'd been broken found something like wholeness in each other. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't happiness without cost. But it was real. And it was theirs. The stars came out one by one, until the sky was a cathedral of light. And in that light they stood together, the woman who'd sent a text to a stranger, and the stranger who'd answered. The federal investigation took time, but it was thorough. What started as a corruption case spiraled into something much larger. The Viper's ledger was just the beginning. It was a thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire structure of organized crime in the city. Judges were indicted. Politicians resigned. The mayor's office was raided, and evidence of decades of corruption was seized. It was the kind of systemic collapse that happened once in a generation, and it all traced back to one thing: a woman texting a wrong number. But there were ripple effects that Imani hadn't anticipated. Federal protection meant she had to testify. It meant sitting in courtrooms across from men who'd hunted her, men who'd tried to break her, men who'd succeeded in breaking others. It meant reliving trauma in front of judges and juries. It meant having her pain examined and questioned and written into official records. It also meant Kang-Dae had to make a choice. He'd been invisible for so long, hidden in the shadows, operating in ways that the law couldn't quite reach. But with Imani's testimony implicating so many people in positions of power, investigators began looking deeper. They began asking questions about the Seven Stars. They began connecting dots that Kang-Dae had worked very hard to keep separate. He could have disappeared. He had the resources, the connections, the knowledge to vanish into a dozen different countries and start over. But he chose to face it instead. The courtroom was sterile and bright, designed to be neutral, to be objective, to strip away emotion and drama and focus on facts and law. But Imani's testimony wasn't about facts. It was about survival. It was about the moment when a man with a gun had proven that justice didn't live in the system. It lived in individual choices. Mr. Kang-Dae shot your ex-husband, the prosecutor asked. Did you see this happen? I heard the shot, Imani testified. But I didn't see it directly. I was in the closet with my daughter. Did you report this to the police? No, Imani said. Because I knew the police wouldn't help me. I called them 17 times in the previous 3 months. They took 45 minutes to respond at best. Detective Rohr was one of the officers who responded to some of those calls. And did he help you? No, Imani said. He suggested I go to a women's shelter. He gave me a phone number. And he left. The prosecutor nodded. So when Mr. Kang-Dae came to your home without being called, without any obligation to be there, what was your reaction? I was terrified, Imani said. But I was also grateful. Because he was there when no one else was. The defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. He was trying to paint Kang-Dae as a manipulative criminal who'd preyed on a vulnerable woman, who'd taken advantage of her desperation to build loyalty and control. Isn't it true that Mr. Kang-Dae is the head of a criminal organization? He asked. Yes, Imani said. And isn't it true that by taking you to his home, he kept you isolated, cut off from family and support systems? No, Imani said. He gave me safety. He gave my daughter safety. He gave me a choice. A choice under duress, the attorney suggested. A choice I made freely, Imani corrected. No one forced me to stay with him. I could have left at any moment. But I didn't want to. The attorney paused, realizing he wasn't going to get the narrative he wanted from her. When Kang-Dae took the stand, the courtroom went very quiet. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's annual salary. His tattoos were covered. His hands were folded in front of him. To a casual observer, he might have looked like any other businessman. But the women in the courtroom, the ones who'd been hunted, the ones who'd survived, the ones who knew what violence looked like when it wore a suit, they recognized him for what he was. A predator who'd chosen to become something else. The prosecutor established the facts. Kang-Dae admitted to shooting Marcus. He admitted to harboring Imani and Zuri without reporting them to the authorities. He admitted to his role in the operation at the docks. Why did you do it? The prosecutor asked. Why did you risk your organization, your freedom, your safety for a woman you'd never met? Kang-Dae looked directly at Imani. Because I was empty, he said. Because I'd spent my entire life acquiring power and money and influence, and none of it filled the void inside me. And then I received that text, and for the first time I felt something real. I felt responsibility toward another person, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. He paused. I've killed people, he continued. I've destroyed lives. I've caused more pain than I can count. I've spent decades perfecting the art of violence and manipulation. But in that moment when I read those words, Mom, he broke my arm. I realized that all of that meant nothing. I realized that I was capable of something beyond violence. I was capable of being someone's salvation instead of their destruction. The defense attorney tried to attack him next, but Kang-Dae didn't fight. He answered every question honestly, admitted to every crime he could be prosecuted for, and made no attempt to minimize his role in the criminal enterprise. By the end of his testimony, it was clear that he wasn't trying to get off. He was trying to testify for the truth. The case went to trial, and the verdict came back after 3 weeks of deliberation. Rohr was found guilty of corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The federal agents who'd been complicit were arrested and prosecuted. The Viper organization was systematically dismantled. As for Kang-Dae, the situation was more complex. He pleaded guilty to the shooting of Marcus, but the court found it to be justifiable homicide. He admitted to harboring fugitives, and the judge sentenced him to time served plus 5 years of probation. He admitted to his role in the dock operation, but that operation had been undertaken to stop a federal crime in progress. The prosecutors decided that pursuing charges would undermine the case against the Vipers. In the end, Kang-Dae walked out of the courthouse a free man, but he walked out transformed. He'd had to give up his control of the Seven Stars organization. He'd had to surrender his criminal empire. What remained was a legitimate business structure, import-export, real estate, various holdings that had always been nominally legal but were now actually legal. He was no longer a crime boss. He was a businessman. And he was Imani's. 6 months after the trial, Imani was living in the cottage permanently. Zuri was in school, a good school, paid for by Kang-Dae's legitimate income. She was doing well, had made friends, was healing in the way that children do, with remarkable resilience and the ability to move forward without being constantly haunted by the past. Imani had started a job at a non-profit that helped women escape domestic violence. She used her experience, her knowledge, her survival to give other women hope. Kang-Dae had donated significantly to the organization, and Imani made sure that it was well run, that it actually helped people instead of just offering platitudes. They weren't married. Imani had been married once, and it had nearly killed her. But they lived together, they shared a life, they were building something that was partnership instead of possession. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Zuri play in the sand, Kang-Dae said something that surprised her. "I received a letter today," he said, "from the federal government. They want me to work with them, to help them understand how organized crime operates, how corruption infiltrates government systems. They're offering immunity, protection, in exchange for my expertise." Imani looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm thinking about it," he said. "I could help them. I could be useful in ways that I've never been useful before. I could spend the rest of my life making sure that what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else." "That's a good life," Imani said. "It's not the life I chose," Kang-Dae replied. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe the best lives are the ones we don't choose, the ones that find us, the ones that transform us in ways we never expected." He reached over and took her hand. "I was supposed to be unreachable," he said. "You were never supposed to text that number. You were supposed to stay hidden from me forever. But fate had other plans." "Do you believe in fate?" Imani asked. "I believe in the moments that change everything," he replied. "And I believe that our moment was right." Mama Sol visited them at the cottage a few weeks later. She was fully recovered, and she'd reopened her apothecary in the night market. She was a hero now, the old woman who'd escaped the vipers and lived to testify against them. She'd become a symbol of resistance, of survival, of the power of community. She brought herbs and tea and she made them all sit down together. Imani, Kang-Dae, and Zuri, while she shared her wisdom. "You know what I realized when I was imprisoned?" Mama Sol asked. None of them answered. They knew she would tell them anyway. "I realized that the vipers were right about one thing," she continued. "The system was broken. The law was broken. Justice didn't exist in the institutions. But they were wrong about the solution. They thought that meant they could do whatever they wanted. They thought that power gave them permission to destroy people." She looked at Kang-Dae. "But you understood something different," she said. "You understood that if the system is broken, then you have to be the system. You have to be justice. You have to be protection. And that's a burden, a heavy burden, but it's also a purpose." She turned to Imani. "And you," Mama Sol said, "you understood something else. You understood that you didn't need the broken system to survive. You didn't need the law or the police or the institution. You just needed one person to care enough to show up. You needed Kang-Dae. And in needing him, you transformed him." She looked at Zuri. "And this little one," Mama Sol said, kneeling down to Zuri's level. "She's learning something that your generation desperately needs to know. She's learning that broken things can be healed. That trauma doesn't have to define you. That love is stronger than violence." She stood up slowly, her old bones creaking. "The world will tell you that fairy tales aren't real," Mama Sol said. "It will tell you that happy endings are for children. But I've lived a long life and I've learned that sometimes, very rarely, the universe gives you exactly what you need at the moment you need it most. And all you have to do is recognize it and hold on to it." She hugged each of them, Imani, Kang-Dae, and Zuri. "Be good to each other," she said. "That's all any of us can do." Years later, when Zuri was older, she would ask her mother about that night. The night when a text went to the wrong number and changed everything. Imani would tell her the story, the full story from beginning to end. She would tell her about fear and survival, and the moment when she realized that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about moving forward anyway. She would tell her about Kang-Dae. About how a man who had been built by violence had chosen to rebuild himself with love. How he'd given up an empire for something more valuable. A family, a purpose, a chance to be better than he'd been. She would tell her about Mama Soul, about community, about the power of people who chose to shelter others despite the danger to themselves. And Zuri would ask, "Do you think it was really fate, Mom? Do you think we were supposed to meet him?" And Imani would smile and say, "I think the universe works in mysterious ways. I think that sometimes the wrong number is actually the right number. And I think that if we're very lucky, very brave, and very willing to take chances on strangers, we find exactly what we need." The cottage sat on a cliff overlooking the sea. From the porch you could see for miles, the horizon stretching out endlessly, the sky merging with the water at some distant vanishing point. It was beautiful, and it was theirs, and it had been purchased with the money of a man who'd transformed violence into love. Kang-Dae worked with the federal government now, helping them dismantle organized crime networks, teaching them how to recognize corruption in their own institutions. He was good at it. His work had exposed networks of crime that had been operating for decades. Imani continued her work at the nonprofit. She'd been promoted to director. She was training other women who'd escaped domestic violence, to help others like them. She was building a network of support, an infrastructure of safety, a system that actually worked because it was built on compassion instead of power. And Zuri grew up knowing that the world was complex and dangerous and beautiful all at once. She grew up knowing that sometimes villains could become heroes. She grew up knowing that the family you're born into is just the beginning. The real family is the one you build, the one you choose, the one that saves you. On quiet evenings, as the sun set over the water and painted the sky in impossible colors, Imani would sit on the porch with Kang-Dae, and they would talk about nothing important. They would talk about the day, about Zuri's school, about the new women's shelter they were opening in the city. They would talk about the future, which was uncertain but no longer terrifying. And sometimes Kang-Dae would say, "I still can't believe that text came to me. Of all the numbers in the world, it came to me." And Imani would reply, "Maybe there are no accidents. Maybe the universe knew exactly where that text needed to go." In the distance, the lights of the city flickered on as darkness fell. Down there, in that grid of streets and buildings, there were other women still trapped, still hunted, still hoping that someone would answer their cry for help. But here on this cliff, outside the reach of the city, Imani and Kang-Dae had built something permanent. They'd built a life that proved that transformation was possible, that love was stronger than violence, that the wrong number could sometimes be the most right number of all. The stars came out one by one, until the entire sky was a cathedral of light. And beneath those stars, two broken people who'd found each other became whole.